The air inside Kayla's soul kitchen was heavy, woven with the rich, intoxicating aromas of slow-simmered collard greens, smoked turkey wings, and the sharp, sweet tang of candied yams caramelizing in cast-iron skillets. It was a Friday night in Atlanta, which meant the line of hungry customers snaked out the glass double doors and wrapped around the brick exterior of the building. At the center of this beautiful, organized chaos stood Kala. At 62, Kala was a striking woman. Her skin was the color of rich roasted chicory, and her silver hair was pulled back into a neat, no-nonsense braided bun. While other women her age were looking toward retirement, Kala's eyes, sharp, observant, and framed by elegant wire-rimmed glasses, missed absolutely nothing. She wore her immaculate white chef's coat like a suit of armor. There was a permanent, faint dusting of flour on her wrists, a testament to the fact that despite having a staff of 30, she still insisted on mixing the cornbread batter herself. It was her grandmother's recipe, a secret guarded more fiercely than the gold in Fort Knox. Table 4 needs a refill on the sweet tea, and tell Marcus to fire up 2 more orders of the catfish, Kayla instructed, her voice a smooth, resonant alto that cut through the clatter of plates and the sizzle of the fryers. She didn't have to yell. When Kayla spoke, people listened. She had built this empire with her bare hands. 40 years ago, she was a single mother scrubbing floors in a downtown diner, saving every crumpled dollar bill in a shoebox under her bed. She had started by selling plates out of the trunk of her beat-up Chevy. Now she owned the building, the parking lot, and 3 other locations across the metropolitan area. Kayla's Soul Kitchen wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution. And then there was Julian. The heavy oak door leading to the private office swung open, and her husband strolled into the kitchen. The temperature in this room seemed to drop a fraction of a degree, though the ovens were blasting at 400 degrees. Julian, at 64, was a man who had aged like fine, expensive leather, mostly because he had spent the last 30 years letting Kala do the heavy lifting. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that cost more than Kala's first car, a crisp lilac shirt open at the collar, and a pair of Italian loafers that had never, not once, stepped in a puddle of kitchen grease. He had the kind of easy, charismatic smile that could charm the money out of a stranger's pocket, and a smooth baritone voice that had whispered sweet, empty promises into Kayla's ear when she was young and exhausted and looking for a partner to share the load. "Evening, beautiful," Julian said, leaning in to press a practiced kiss to Kayla's cheek. He smelled of expensive sandalwood cologne, a scent that usually comforted her, but tonight there was a faint, discordant undertone beneath it, something cloyingly sweet, floral, cheap. Kayla didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She wiped her hands on a clean towel, her dark eyes scanning his immaculate outfit. "You're dressed up for a Friday night, Julian. I thought you were going over the supplier contracts in the back office." Julian waved a manicured hand dismissively, flashing his pearly white teeth. "Oh, you know how it is, baby. I had to pivot. Had a last-minute dinner meeting with those real estate developers from Buckhead, the ones looking to franchise our name. It's all about networking, Kala. You focus on the recipes. Let me handle the expansion." Kayla kept her face perfectly neutral. "Our name," he had said. It was her name on the neon sign outside. It was her recipes keeping the lights on. Julian had appointed himself the chief financial officer of the business decades ago, a title that essentially meant he played golf on Wednesdays, took 2-hour lunches, and signed papers that Kayla's accountants had already thoroughly vetted. "Buckhead," Kayla repeated softly, turning her attention back to a bubbling pot of gravy. "I didn't see anything on the shared calendar." Julian's smile tightened, just a fraction. If you didn't know him, you would miss it. But Kala had been married to the man for 35 years. She knew the map of his face better than she knew the lines on her own palms. It was spur of the moment. You know how these corporate types are. Anyway, I need you to transfer about $5,000 into the joint checking by tomorrow morning. I've got to cover the deposit for the country club gala next month. Good for business." Kayla's hand paused on the wooden spoon. $5,000. It wasn't a crippling amount. The restaurant made that in a few hours on a weekend. But it was the casual entitlement in his voice that grated against her spine. "I'll have the bank handle it on Monday," she said smoothly, not looking at him. "I kind of need it for the weekend, baby," Julian pressed, stepping closer, his voice dropping an octave into that smooth, persuasive tone he used when he wanted something. "Monday, Julian," Kayla said, turning her head to meet his gaze directly. Her eyes were hard, unyielding obsidian. "The banks are closed. and I am busy." Julian held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his charm faltering for a second before he recovered. All right. The boss lady has spoken. Don't work too late, Kala. You're not as young as you used to be." He patted her shoulder and walked out of the kitchen, slipping out the back exit. Kala stood perfectly still, the heat of the stove warming her front, while a sudden, inexplicable chill crawled up the back of her neck. "You're not as young as you used to be." It was framed as concern, but it felt like a tiny, deliberate paper cut. She took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of her kitchen, trying to ground herself. "Don't go looking for ghosts, Kayla," she told herself. But the ghost was already there, lingering in the air, that cheap, sweet floral scent. It clung to the inside of her nose like a stubborn weed. 2 hours later, the dinner rush finally began to subside. Kayla was at the front counter, wiping down the polished brass register, when the front chimes jingled. Her heart instinctively warmed as she looked up and saw her son walking through the door. Marcus was 32, built like a brick house, with broad shoulders inherited from his grandfather and the same warm, intelligent eyes as his mother. He was wearing his Atlanta Fire Department Station t-shirt, his boots heavy against the floorboards. Marcus was a captain now, a man who ran into burning buildings to save strangers. He was Kayla's ultimate pride, the living, breathing proof that all her sacrifices had meant something. "Hey, Mama," Marcus smiled, wrapping his massive arms around her in a bear hug that lifted her slightly off the floor. "Put me down, boy, you're going to break my ribs," Kayla scolded gently, though she was smiling ear to ear. She kissed his cheek, noting the faint smell of smoke that always seemed to linger in his pores. "You hungry? I saved you a plate of the smothered pork chops. I know you like the gravy extra thick." "You know I can never say no to that," Marcus laughed, setting her down. It was then that Kayla noticed the woman trailing a few steps behind him. Allison. Allison was 28, a former Instagram model who had snagged Marcus 3 years ago. She was undeniably beautiful, with long, bone-straight extensions, perfectly arched eyebrows, and acrylic nails painted a striking crimson. Tonight, she was wearing a silk slip dress and clutching a designer handbag that cost more than Marcus's monthly salary. "Hi, Kayla," Allison said, her voice high-pitched and breathless. She didn't step forward for a hug. She stood near the door, her nose subtly wrinkled as if the smell of fried food was an insult to her silk dress. "Hello, Allison," Kayla replied, her tone polite but measured. "You're looking very dressed up for a Friday night at a soul food joint." Allison let out a nervous, tinkling laugh, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Oh, you know, just trying to keep the spark alive. Marcus promised he'd take me to that new French place downtown after he grabbed a bite here." Marcus looked sheepish, running a hand over his short hair. "Sorry, Mama, we can't stay long. Just wanted to pop in and see you. Allison has reservations." Kayla nodded slowly, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She loved her son fiercely, but she had never quite warmed to Allison. There was a hollow center to the girl, a bottomless hunger for things, clothes, cars, status, that Marcus's honest civil servant salary struggled to satisfy. Kayla had watched Marcus pick up extra shifts, working himself to the bone, while Allison spent her days curating her brand at upscale cafes. "I'll have the kitchen box it up for you, baby," Kayla said to Marcus. As she turned, she caught Allison's reflection in the mirrored wall behind the counter. Allison wasn't looking at Marcus. She wasn't looking at Kayla. She was staring at the back hallway, the exact hallway Julian had exited through 2 hours earlier, and in her eyes there was a strange, restless energy, a feverish kind of impatience. "Oh, Kayla," Allison suddenly said, stepping up to the counter. As she moved, the air shifted, wafting her perfume across the counter. Kayla froze. Her hand tightened around the wet rag in her hand until her knuckles turned a stark, ashen gray. It was sweet, floral, cloying. It was the exact same cheap alien scent that had been clinging to Julian's charcoal gray suit. "Could we maybe get a side of mac and cheese with that?" Allison asked, oblivious to the sudden, absolute stillness of the older woman in front of her. "I know I shouldn't, carbs and all, but yours is just so addictive." Kayla's heart was suddenly beating out a frantic tribal rhythm against her ribs, but 40 years in the restaurant business had taught her how to wear a mask. She forced her facial muscles to relax. She smiled, a terrifyingly calm, maternal smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Let me go get that for you." Kayla retreated to the kitchen, her mind spinning like a centrifuge. Coincidence? A small, desperate voice in her head whispered, It's a popular perfume. Millions of women wear it. Don't be crazy. But Kayla wasn't a woman who believed in coincidences. She believed in patterns. She believed in the math of human behavior. Julian asking for $5,000 in cash. Julian taking a back exit. Allison wearing a silk slip dress to a soul food restaurant just to pop in. Allison's restless eyes darting toward the back hallway. The perfume. It was a tiny crack in the foundation of her empire. But Kayla knew better than anyone that a single crack, left unchecked, could bring down a whole house. At 1 a.m., the restaurant was finally closed. The staff had gone home, the fryers were scrubbed clean, and the floors were mopped. The only light left on was the fluorescent hum in Kayla's back office. Kayla sat at her heavy mahogany desk, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. In front of her was her laptop, open to the restaurant's main business accounts, and next to it, her personal banking portal. Julian was the CFO, yes, but Kayla had never relinquished the master passwords. A woman who builds her own house never gives away the only set of keys. She pulled up the joint checking account, the one Julian used for business expenses. She scrolled back through the last 3 months, her eyes scanning the rows of numbers with the precision of a hawk looking for field mice. There it was, 3 weeks ago, a withdrawal of $12,000, labeled simply as consulting retainer. 2 weeks ago, a wire transfer of $8,500 to an account labeled AM Holdings LLC. Last Tuesday, a cash withdrawal of $3,000. Kayla's breath hitched in her throat. Tens of thousands of dollars, quietly bleeding out of the accounts. Julian had mentioned expanding, yes, but he had never provided invoices for these amounts. And what in God's name was AM Holdings LLC? She opened a new tab and typed the LLC name into the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry. She hit enter. The little loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the page populated. Entity name, AM Holdings LLC. Registered agent, Allison Miller. Allison's maiden name. The silence in the office became deafening. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, leaving a cold, hard vacuum in its wake. Kayla stared at the glowing screen, the blue light reflecting in her dark, unblinking eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together with the brutal force of a sledgehammer. The money, the perfume, the sneaky glances. Her husband. Her lazy, smooth-talking, entitled husband, who hadn't lifted a bag of flour in 30 years, was siphoning money from her sweat and blood and funneling it to her daughter-in-law. To Marcus's wife. A lesser woman might have screamed. A lesser woman might have picked up the heavy brass paperweight on the desk and hurled it through the glass window. A lesser woman might have driven home, kicked the bedroom door open, and demanded answers in a tearful, hysterical rage. But Kayla had not survived poverty, single motherhood, and the cutthroat restaurant business by throwing tantrums. She had survived by being smarter, colder, and infinitely more patient than her enemies. She reached out with a steady hand and closed the laptop. She didn't print the pages. She didn't save screenshots. She didn't need to. The numbers, the LLC, the dates, they were burned into her retinas, branded into her brain. Kayla stood up, turned off the office light, and locked the door behind her. As she walked out to her car in the empty, dark parking lot, the humid Atlanta night air wrapped around her. Julian and Allison thought she was just an old, tired woman flipping chicken in a kitchen. They thought she was a cash cow, too blind and too trusting to notice the leeches attached to her underbelly. They thought they were playing a game that Kayla didn't even know the rules to. She got into her car, gripping the leather steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, she looked at her own reflection. The soft maternal warmth that usually rested in her features was gone, replaced by something ancient, formidable, and deeply dangerous. "You want to steal from my kitchen?" Kayla whispered to the empty car, her voice a low, gravelly promise. "Fine, but I'm going to make you eat every single thing you cook." She started the engine and drove into the night. The war hadn't just begun. Kayla had already decided exactly how it was going to end. Here is part 2 of the story. It delves deep into the psychological warfare Kayla must wage within her own mind, the shocking visual confirmation of the affair, and the devastating financial twist that elevates the conflict from a mere domestic dispute to a battle for her life's work. Saturday morning broke over Atlanta with a humid golden haze. Inside Kayla's sprawling 5-bedroom home in the affluent suburbs of Cascade Heights, A home paid for in cash by the thousands of peach cobblers and fried chickens she had sold over the decades. The air was suffocatingly quiet. Julian was in the kitchen, humming a cheerful off-key tune as he poured himself a cup of organic dark roast coffee. He was dressed in his Saturday best, a pastel yellow polo shirt, crisp khaki shorts, and a pristine white visor. "Morning, Kayla Bear," he chirped as she walked into the kitchen, wrapped in her thick navy blue silk robe. "I'm hitting the links with the boys at the country club. Might be late. We've got a lot of networking to do for this new expansion idea." "Have fun, Julian," Kayla said. Her voice was perfectly level, a placid lake hiding a deadly undertow. She poured herself a glass of ice water, not trusting her hands to hold anything hot. Julian kissed her on the forehead, a dry, perfunctory peck, grabbed his titanium golf clubs, and headed out the door. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, and the deadbolt engaged automatically. Kayla stood in the silence of her immaculate kitchen for exactly 1 minute. Then she walked into the den and picked up her iPad. A year ago, there had been a string of package thefts in their upscale neighborhood. Julian, claiming he was too busy dealing with contractors, had told Kayla to handle the security. So she did. She hired a top-tier tech firm to install a state-of-the-art smart home system. There were visible cameras on the porches, of course, but Kayla, a woman who had spent 40 years managing inventory and preventing employee theft, had quietly instructed the technicians to install one more. It was a tiny, wide-angle lens embedded in a faux smoke detector right above the grand entryway chandelier. It covered the front door, the sweeping staircase, and the entrance to the formal living room. Julian didn't even know what the app icon looked like. Sitting in her oversized leather armchair, Kayla opened the app. Her heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her sternum. She navigated to the archives for Friday afternoon, right around 3 p.m., the time Julian claimed to be at a late lunch, shortly before he had strolled into her restaurant smelling of alien perfume. She dragged the timeline slider back. The screen buffered for a second, then sharpened into crisp 1080p high-definition color. Timestamp, 3:12 p.m. The front door opened. Julian walked in. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket yet. He loosened his tie, looking perfectly relaxed. He didn't go upstairs. He left the front door unlocked and paced the foyer, checking his gold Rolex. Timestamp 3:15 p.m. The door opened again. Allison slipped inside. She was wearing the same silk slip dress she had worn to the restaurant later that evening. Kayla's breath stopped in her throat. She stared at the screen, her grip on the iPad tightening so fiercely her knuckles ached. On the screen, Allison didn't greet Julian like a daughter-in-law. There was no polite hug. She dropped her designer bag on the expensive Persian rug, walked straight up to Julian, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Julian's hands immediately went to her waist, pulling her flush against his body. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply, breathing in that cloying, cheap floral perfume that had haunted Kayla the night before. Then their lips met. It wasn't a quick, secretive kiss. It was deep, hungry, and entirely practiced. It was the kiss of two people who had done this 100 times before. Kayla tapped the screen to unmute the audio. The hidden microphone was highly sensitive, designed to pick up whispers. "God, you look good," Julian's voice murmured through the iPad speakers, distorted slightly by the digital compression, but undeniably his. "Is she gone?" Allison whispered, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of Julian's neck. "She's at the restaurant, where she always is, working herself to the bone." Julian chuckled, a cruel, dismissive sound that hit Kayla like a physical blow to the stomach. "We have the whole afternoon, baby," Allison giggled, a high, grating sound. "Good, because Daddy needs to help me relax before I have to play the dutiful wife for Marcus tonight." Julian grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the camera's frame, heading toward the downstairs guest suite. The footage continued to roll, showing nothing but the empty, beautiful foyer that Kayla had paid for. Kayla hit pause. The image froze on Allison's designer bag resting on Kayla's custom-imported rug. Nausea rose in Kayla's throat, thick and acidic. She stood up abruptly, dropping the iPad onto the armchair, and rushed to the downstairs powder room. She gripped the edges of the marble sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror, gasping for air. Her husband. Her son's wife. The betrayal was so immense, so grotesque, that her brain struggled to process the geometry of it. It was a double homicide of trust. Julian was defiling their marriage, yes, but far worse. He was making a fool of Marcus. He was allowing Marcus to come home every night, exhausted from saving lives, to kiss a woman who had spent the afternoon in his own father's bed. A hot, stinging tear escaped Kala's left eye, carving a path down her dark cheek. But it was only one. Kala wiped it away with a trembling thumb. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and when she opened them again, the tears were gone. The shock was receding, leaving behind a cold, desolate wasteland of absolute clarity. They thought she was a workhorse, an ATM machine, an old, tired fool. Let them think it, Kala thought, splashing cold water on her face. Let them gorge themselves at the trough. They don't know the butcher is locking the barn doors. On Monday morning, Kala didn't go to the restaurant. Instead, she drove her black Mercedes SUV to a nondescript office park in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. She walked into an office that simply read, Vance & Associates, Private Investigations. Vance was a retired Atlanta PD detective in his late 50s, a man with a graying buzz cut, sharp eyes, and a quiet demeanor. He had been a regular at Kala's Soul Kitchen for 15 years, often sitting in the corner booth reading case files over a plate of meatloaf. Kala had catered his daughter's wedding at cost. There was a mutual, unspoken respect between them. Kala, Vance said, standing up from his desk, surprised. This is a rare honor. Is everything all right? Somebody giving the restaurants trouble? Kala sat down in the leather chair across from him. She didn't bother with small talk. She opened her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the desk. I need you to look into an LLC, Kala said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. AM Holdings LLC, registered to an Allison Miller. I also need you to follow my husband Julian and my daughter-in-law Allison. I need financial records, bank statements, texts, and locations. I want to know where every dime of their money goes, who they owe, and what they are planning. Vance stopped reaching for the envelope. He looked at Kala, his detective instincts instantly reading the icy stillness in her posture. He had been a cop for 30 years. He knew what a woman looked like when her world had ended. Kala, your daughter-in-law? Marcus's wife? Vance asked softly. Yes. Kala's jaw tightened. Marcus doesn't know, and he cannot know. Not until I have every single piece of the puzzle locked down. Vance nodded slowly, sliding the envelope toward himself. Consider it done. Give me 4 days. Those 4 days were the most excruciating performance of Kala's entire life. She went to work. She smiled at her customers. She tasted the gravy. She balanced the registers. At night, she came home, slept in the same king-sized bed as Julian, and listened to him snore. She made his coffee. She ironed his shirts. Every time he touched her shoulder, it took every ounce of her monumental willpower not to recoil in disgust. The true test came on Thursday evening. It was family dinner night at Kala's house. Marcus arrived straight from the firehouse, looking exhausted but happy. Allison arrived in a pristine white sundress, carrying a bottle of wine she had undoubtedly bought with Kala's money. Kala served them a feast, braised short ribs, garlic mashed potatoes, and roasted asparagus. She sat at the head of the dining table, the grand matriarch, watching the scene unfold like a twisted, grotesque stage play. This is amazing, Kala, Allison said, taking a delicate bite of a short rib. She reached under the table, supposedly adjusting her napkin. Kala's eyes flicked to Julian. Julian's posture was suddenly rigid, a faint, unnatural smirk playing on his lips. Kala knew, with sickening certainty, that Allison's foot or hand was currently caressing Julian's leg beneath the mahogany table, right across from Marcus. I'm glad you like it, Allison, Kala said, offering a warm, serene smile. Eat up. You're looking a little thin lately. The stress of managing your brand must be getting to you. Allison's smile faltered for a microsecond before snapping back into place. Oh, you know, it's a grind. Marcus reached out and took Allison's hand, kissing her knuckles. She works hard, Mama. I'm proud of her. It took everything Kala had, the strength of her ancestors, the discipline of 40 years in kitchens, not to stand up, grab the carving knife, and end the charade right there. Her heart bled for her son. His honest, pure love was being used as a shield by 2 parasites. Soon, my boy, Kala promised silently. Mama is going to clean house. On Friday morning, Kala's burner phone, a prepaid device she had bought specifically for this, vibrated in her purse. It was a text from Vance. I have it. It's worse than you thought. Come to the office. When Kayla arrived at Vance's office, the blinds were drawn. Vance didn't offer her coffee. He looked grim, his hands resting on a dossier that was nearly 3 inches thick. "Kayla, I've seen a lot of dirty domestic cases in my time," Vance started, his voice heavy. "But this is a masterclass in audacity." "Tell me," Kayla commanded, sitting down, her spine ramrod straight. "Let's start with your daughter-in-law," Vance said, opening the folder. "Allison Miller isn't a brand ambassador. She's a gambling addict. High-stakes online casinos, underground poker games in Buckhead, you name it. Over the last 2 years, she has racked up massive losses. She hides it from Marcus by routing everything through offshore crypto wallets, but I tracked the IP addresses and the bank transfers." He slid a spreadsheet across the table. The numbers were highlighted in red. "She currently owes $240,000, Vance stated bluntly, and not to Visa or MasterCard. She owes it to some very unsavory private lenders, people who break kneecaps when they don't get paid." Kayla stared at the staggering number, $240,000. It made sense now, the anxiety she had seen in Allison's eyes, the desperate need for cash. "So she seduced Julian to get him to pay her debts," Kayla deduced, her voice clipped. "That explains the 12 grand, the 8 grand. He's been feeding her creditors from my joint account." "Yes," Vance said, "but that's pennies. Julian can't pull $250,000 in cash out of your business without you noticing, and Allison's creditors are demanding payment in full by the end of the month." Vance reached into the folder and pulled out a stapled, multi-page document. The seal on the front belonged to a major commercial bank in Atlanta. He pushed it across the desk toward Kayla. "What is this?" Kayla asked, picking it up. "It's a commercial loan application," Vance said quietly, "for a line of credit amounting to $500,000. Kayla frowned. "I haven't applied for any loans. We're entirely debt-free." "Look at the collateral, Kayla." Kayla flipped to the second page. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, landing on the property address listed under Assets Pledged. It was the address of her flagship restaurant, the building she owned free and clear, the very heart of Kala's Soul Kitchen. "They are trying to take out a $500,000 mortgage against your primary restaurant," Vance explained, tapping the paper. "Julian is listed as the co-applicant, leveraging his title as CFO, but since you are the primary deed holder, your signature is required." Kayla flipped to the final page. There on the dotted line was her signature, Kayla M. Roberts. It was perfect. The loop of the K, the aggressive slash of the T. But she had never signed it. "It's a forgery," Kayla whispered, the room suddenly spinning. "A damn good one," Vance agreed. "I pulled the IP logs from the digital signing software. It was sent to Julian's email, and the signature was executed from his laptop. Furthermore, the loan documents stipulate that the $500,000 payout is to be wired directly into the receiving account of AM Holdings, LLC. The entire monstrous plot finally unspooled before Kayla's eyes, ugly and complete. They weren't just having an affair. They were executing a financial assassination. Julian and Allison were forging her signature to mortgage her life's work. They planned to take the $500,000, pay off Allison's dangerous gambling debts, and likely pocket the rest to run away together. And what would happen to Kayla? She would wake up one morning to find a bank demanding massive monthly payments she hadn't prepared for. If she couldn't pay, they would foreclose on the flagship restaurant. Her empire would collapse, her employees would lose their jobs, and she would be left bankrupt, holding the bag for a loan she never took. "The loan is in the final underwriting stage," Vance warned. "It's scheduled to be approved and funded next Wednesday. Kayla, you need to go to the police. This is federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. You have to shut this down right now." Kayla sat in the dim office, holding the forged document. Her hands, which had trembled in the bathroom days ago, were now completely still. A profound, terrifying calm washed over her. To go to the police meant a messy public trial. It meant Marcus would find out through a phone call from a detective. It meant Julian and Allison might try to spin a defense, claiming Kayla had authorized it and forgotten. No, the police were too clean. The justice system was too clinical. Julian and Allison had tried to burn down her house while she was sleeping in it. She wasn't going to just call the fire department. She was going to lock the doors and let them burn in the fire they had started. Kayla looked up at Vance, her dark eyes flashing with a ruthless, calculated brilliance. "No police, Not yet, Kayla said, sliding the forged document back into her bag. Vance, do you know a good corporate attorney? Someone who specializes in blind trusts and asset relocation? Someone who works very, very fast? Vance leaned back in his chair, a slow, admiring smile creeping onto his face. I know the best shark in Atlanta. What are you planning, Kayla? Kayla stood up, buttoning her blazer, the matriarch of an empire preparing for war. They want to play with my money, Kayla said softly. I'm going to teach them exactly what it costs. Here is part 3 of the story. This chapter shifts the narrative from the shock of discovery to the cold, calculated execution of Kayla's counterattack. The tension builds as she wears her mask, sets the legal traps, and uncovers the most devastating secret of all. The hardest thing Kayla had ever done in her 62 years of life was not building a restaurant empire from scratch. It was not working 18-hour days over boiling fryers, and it was not raising a son while her husband played golf. The hardest thing Kayla had ever done was making Julian his Sunday morning pancakes. She stood at the kitchen island, the morning sun streaming through the plantation shutters, casting long, peaceful shadows across the marble countertops. She whisked the batter with a steady rhythm, the soft clink-clink-clink of the metal wire against the glass bowl echoing in the quiet house. Julian came downstairs at 9 a.m. wearing a plush cashmere sweater and his usual easygoing smile. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and pressed a kiss to the side of her head. Every muscle in Kayla's body screamed. Her skin crawled where his hands touched her. Her stomach lurched at the faint scent of his cologne, forever tainted by the memory of Allison's cheap floral perfume. She wanted to turn around and drive the whisk into his chest. She wanted to scream until the crystal chandelier shattered. Instead, Kayla relaxed her shoulders, leaned back into his embrace by exactly 1 inch, and let out a soft, contented sigh. "Morning, Julian," she said, her voice smooth as melted butter. "Pancakes are almost ready. Blueberry, just the way you like them." "You are an angel on earth, Kayla," Julian murmured, taking a seat at the breakfast nook and opening the Sunday paper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." You'd be living in a cardboard box under the I-85 overpass, Kayla thought, but she smiled, flipping a perfectly golden pancake onto a porcelain plate. "How are the expansion plans coming along?" she asked casually, pouring him a cup of black coffee. "You've been working so hard with that LLC. What was it called? AM Holdings?" Julian didn't even flinch. His sociopathic calm was almost impressive. He took a sip of his coffee, not missing a beat. "Oh yes, it's just a shell company the developers set up for tax purposes. Nothing you need to worry your pretty head about, baby. I'm handling all the heavy lifting. In fact, I might need you to sign some routine paperwork next week to finalize the zoning permits." He's grooming me for the forged signature, Kayla realized. If the bank ever called to verify, Julian wanted Kayla primed to say, "Yes, I signed some routine paperwork." It was a brilliant serpentine lie. "Whatever you need, Julian," Kayla said, setting the plate of pancakes in front of him. "You know I trust you completely." Julian smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine pleasure. He truly believed he had won. He believed he was the master of the house, manipulating his aging, oblivious wife with the ease of a puppeteer. Kayla watched him pour maple syrup over his breakfast. She was a woman who had spent her entire life feeding people. Now she was going to let Julian gorge himself on his own arrogance, right up until the slaughter. On Monday morning, Kayla sat in a corner office on the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The office belonged to Diane Sterling, the most ruthless and expensive corporate attorney in the state of Georgia. Diane was a woman in her late 50s, sharp-featured, dressed in an immaculate white Tom Ford suit, with eyes that looked like they could cut glass. She reviewed the dossier Vance had compiled, her manicured finger tracing the lines of the forged commercial loan application. "This is incredibly brazen," Diane said, her voice a low, raspy purr. "Forging the primary deed holder's signature on a $500,000 commercial lien. If this loan funds, Julian and Allison commit federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The holy trinity of white-collar felonies. Vance said the loan is scheduled to fund on Wednesday," Kayla said, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "He said I should go to the police and stop it." Diane looked up over the rim of her reading glasses, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her lips. "Vance is a former cop. Cops think in terms of prevention. But you and I, Kayla..." We are businesswomen. We don't just prevent, we profit. I don't want their money, Kayla said coldly. I want them ruined. I want my restaurants safe, and I want them to drown in the debt they tried to bury me in. And that is exactly what we are going to do, Diane said, standing up and walking to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city. If you go to the police now, Julian will claim he made a mistake, or that Allison tricked him, or that you verbally authorized it. It becomes a messy he said, she said. We don't want a domestic dispute, Kala. We want an execution. Diane turned around, her eyes gleaming with legal malice. Here is the play, Diane began, tapping the forged document. You are the sole owner of the real estate for Kala's Soul Kitchen. Today, right now, we are going to execute an emergency transfer of that deed. We are moving the restaurant and all your liquid assets into an irrevocable blind trust, the Marcus Roberts Dynasty Trust. You will be the trustee. Your son is the sole beneficiary. Julian will have absolutely zero legal access to it. Kayla nodded slowly. But what about the loan? The bank thinks they are securing the $500,000 against my building. Exactly, Diane smiled, sitting back down. We let the loan proceed. I happen to know the senior underwriter at this particular commercial bank. I am going to make a highly confidential, off-the-record phone call to their fraud department today. We are going to let Julian and Allison sign the final closing documents on Wednesday. The bank will wire the $500,000 into Allison's LLC. Kayla frowned, leaning forward. Why would the bank give them the money if they know it's a fraud? Because it's a sting operation, Kayla, Diane explained softly. The bank isn't actually going to use their own money. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division works closely with these banks. Once Julian and Allison move that money, the second they try to wire it to Allison's illegal gambling creditors, the trap snaps shut. Diane leaned across the desk, her voice dropping to a whisper. But here is the beautiful part. Because the deed to your restaurant was legally transferred to the irrevocable trust before the loan closed, the bank has no claim on your business. Your empire is bulletproof. Julian, however, signed as a personal guarantor on a fraudulent loan. He and Allison will be left holding a $500,000 debt they cannot discharge in bankruptcy, while facing 10 to 20 years in federal prison. Kayla felt a deep, profound thrill run through her veins. It was a cold, dark satisfaction. She reached into her purse and pulled out her checkbook. Where do I sign, Diane? For the next 3 hours, Kayla signed her name dozens of times. She signed away the deed to her flagship store. She signed away her investment accounts. She moved 40 years of sweat, tears, and burned fingers into an impenetrable legal fortress built for her son. By the time she left the skyscraper, Kayla Roberts on paper was a woman with nothing but the clothes on her back. But in reality, she was a queen who had just moved her entire kingdom behind castle walls. That evening, Marcus stopped by the house. Kayla was in the den, knitting a blanket, a mundane, repetitive task that helped keep her hands from shaking with adrenaline. Hey, Mama, Marcus sighed, collapsing onto the leather sofa across from her. He looked drained. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent. Long shift, baby? Kayla asked, setting her knitting down. Yeah, 3-alarm fire at a warehouse in Decatur. But that's not it. Marcus rubbed his temples, staring at the floor. It's Allison. She's been different lately. Moody, sick in the mornings. She snapped at me for buying the wrong brand of orange juice yesterday. I just feel like I can't do anything right by her. Kayla's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces for her boy. He was a good man, a hero to strangers, but a punching bag in his own home. He was twisting himself into knots trying to please a woman who was actively planning his financial ruin. Marcus, look at me, Kayla said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a mother. He looked up, surprised by her tone. You are a good man, Kayla said fiercely, her dark eyes locking onto his. You are kind, you are hardworking, and you have a heart of gold. Do not ever let anyone, not a friend, not a boss, and certainly not a wife, make you feel like you are not enough. Do you hear me? Marcus blinked, taken aback by the intensity in her voice. Then a small, weary smile touched his lips. I hear you, Mama. Thank you. I think she might be stressed. Actually, I was thinking she might be pregnant. We've been trying, you know? The air in the room suddenly turned to ice. Kala kept her face perfectly still, but beneath her ribs, her heart skipped a violent beat. Pregnant. Is she? Kayla asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She hasn't taken a test yet, or at least she hasn't told me, Marcus shrugged, looking hopeful. But if she is, maybe that explains the mood swings. A baby would be a blessing, Mama. It might bring us closer. Kayla forced a smile, reaching out to pat his knee. Whatever happens, Marcus, you know I will always protect you. Always. When Marcus left, Kayla immediately pulled out her burner phone. She texted Vance, I need you to look into Allison's medical records. Specifically, OBGYN visits. 2 days later, Tuesday night, the eve of the loan funding. Kayla was sitting in the dark back office of the restaurant, the only illumination coming from the glowing neon sign outside her window. The door clicked open and Vance slipped inside, locking the deadbolt behind him. He didn't look triumphant. He looked sick to his stomach. You were right, Vance said heavily, pulling up a chair across from her desk. He didn't hand her a folder this time. He slid a single, glossy black and white photograph across the mahogany surface. Kayla looked down. It was a sonogram, the grainy image of an 8-week-old fetus curled in the darkness. She went to a private clinic in Buckhead 3 days ago, Vance explained, his voice low. She paid in cash. So she is pregnant, Kayla murmured. A tragic, complicated wave of emotion washed over her. A grandchild, part of Marcus. How was she going to navigate destroying Allison if she was carrying Marcus's child? Kayla, Vance said gently, interrupting her thoughts. Look at the next page. He slid a printout of intercepted text messages across the desk. Vance had used a mirroring software to clone Allison's phone data, highly illegal, but Kayla was far past caring about privacy laws. Kayla put on her reading glasses. The text thread was between Allison and Julian. Allison, 10:14 a.m. Just left the clinic. It's confirmed. 8 weeks. Julian, 10:16 a.m. Are you sure? What did the doctor say? Allison, 10:18 a.m. I'm sure. And Marcus hasn't touched me in 2 months because of his opposite shifts. It's yours, Daddy. Kayla stopped breathing. The neon light outside buzzed, a harsh electric sound that seemed to drill directly into her skull. It's yours, Daddy. Her husband. Her 64-year-old husband had impregnated her 28-year-old daughter-in-law. Kayla forced her eyes back to the page. The nightmare wasn't over. Julian, 10:20 a.m. My God, what are we going to do? If Marcus finds out the timing doesn't add up. Allison, 10:25 a.m. Relax, I told him we're trying. We sleep together once this weekend, and I tell him I'm pregnant next month. He'll think it's his. We get the $500,000 from the bank tomorrow. I pay off my guys, and we use the rest to set up our new life in Miami. When I file for divorce, Marcus will be on the hook for 18 years of child support for your kid. It's the perfect exit strategy. The papers fluttered slightly from Kayla's trembling hands. It was a level of evil so profound, so sociopathic, that it defied human comprehension. They weren't just stealing her money. They were planning to chain her son to a lifetime of financial slavery, raising a child born from his own father's betrayal. Allison viewed a living, breathing child not as a blessing, but as an exit strategy and a weapon of extortion. Kayla? Vance asked, leaning forward, genuinely concerned. Kayla had gone perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the text messages, unblinking. Do you need a minute? Slowly, Kayla looked up. She took off her reading glasses and set them gently on the desk. There were no tears this time. There was no nausea. The pain had burned entirely through her system, leaving nothing behind but a pure, white-hot, incandescent rage. She felt the spirit of every woman in her bloodline who had been used, discarded, and underestimated rise up within her. She was Kala Roberts. She had built an empire from the dirt, and she would not allow 2 parasites to feast on her son's future. Tomorrow is Wednesday, Kala said. Her voice didn't shake. It resonated with the terrifying absolute finality of a judge passing a death sentence. Tomorrow, they sign the papers. Yes, Vance nodded. Diane Sterling confirmed the sting is set. The bank is ready. Kayla picked up the sonogram picture and the text messages. She carefully folded them and placed them in her purse. Good, Kayla whispered, a chilling, razor-thin smile curving her lips in the dark office. Let them sign. And then I am going to burn their entire world to ash. Wednesday came and went with a sickening, silent efficiency. Diane Sterling, Kayla's ruthless attorney, sent a single encrypted text message at 2:15 p.m. The bait is taken, documents signed, trap armed. Julian came home that evening in a spectacular mood. He brought Calla a bouquet of 24 white roses and poured her a glass of expensive champagne, toasting to future expansions. Calla drank the champagne, smiled over the rim of her crystal flute, and thought about how perfectly those white roses would look resting on the grave of his ego. By Friday morning, the stage was set for the social execution. "I still hate that you have to fly up to Chicago for this vendor convention on a Friday," Julian said, leaning against the doorway of their master bedroom closet as Calla packed a sleek leather carry-on. He was already wearing a silk robe, sipping his morning espresso, looking every inch the relaxed master of the manor. "You know how these national food distributors are, Julian," Calla said smoothly, folding a silk blouse with practiced precision. "If I want Calla's Soul Kitchen sauces in their grocery aisles by next quarter, I have to shake the hands myself. I'll be back Sunday night." "Well, get the deal done, boss lady," Julian smiled, walking over to kiss her cheek. "I'll just hold down the fort, catch up on some reading, maybe play a quiet 9 holes. Calla zipped her suitcase. "You enjoy your quiet weekend, Julian." An Uber Black pulled up to the sweeping circular driveway of the estate at 10 a.m. Julian waved from the grand portico as Calla's car disappeared down the oak-lined street. What Julian didn't know was that the Uber only drove 3 blocks. It pulled into the driveway of Calla's closest friend and neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. Calla stepped out, walked through Mrs. Higgins' adjoining backyard gate, and slipped right back onto the lower terrace of her own sprawling 2-acre property. Julian and Calla's estate was massive. The master suite was situated on the 3rd floor of the east wing, looking out over the front driveway and the street. The rear of the property, however, cascaded down into a lush, secluded lower garden, completely invisible and heavily soundproofed from the main house by thick stone retaining walls and a dense line of weeping willows. Down in that hidden garden pavilion, the trap was already being laid. For the past 2 weeks, under the guise of absolute secrecy, Calla had been organizing a surprise party. She had told everyone, her family, her church friends, the neighborhood association, and most importantly, Marcus's entire crew from Firehouse 42, that she was throwing a massive backyard BBQ to celebrate Marcus's recent promotion to captain. By 2 p.m., the lower pavilion was alive. The massive custom brick smokers were rolling out thick, fragrant clouds of hickory and mesquite. Long tables were draped in checkered linens, groaning under the weight of Calla's famous brisket, ribs, macaroni and cheese, and peach cobbler. The warm, humid Georgia air buzzed with the sound of laughter, the clinking of iced tea glasses, and the low, soulful hum of classic R&B playing over the state-of-the-art outdoor sound system. At 2:30 p.m., Marcus arrived. He walked through the back gate in his civilian clothes, jeans and a fitted Henley, expecting to help his mother fix a broken sprinkler head, which had been the excuse she used to get him there. When 50 people suddenly yelled, "Surprise!" Marcus actually jumped back, his hands flying up in shock, before a massive beaming smile broke across his handsome face. His Firehouse brothers tackled him in a group hug, clapping him on the back. "Mama, you didn't have to do all this," Marcus laughed as Calla walked up, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You deserve to be celebrated, my beautiful boy," Calla said, her voice fiercely tender. She looked around the crowd. "Where is Allison? I thought she'd be riding with you." A flicker of tension crossed Marcus's eyes, quickly masked. "She said she had a terrible migraine. She wanted to stay in bed and sleep it off in the dark. I didn't want to push her." A migraine, Calla thought, the ice in her veins solidifying. "Right. Well, we will just have to celebrate without her," Calla said smoothly. She turned her gaze up toward the distant, towering roofline of the main house. From down in the sunken pavilion, the house looked like a silent fortress. But Calla's phone was buzzing in her pocket. The smart home app was sending motion sensor alerts. Front door opened. 2:45 p.m. Master suite motion detected. 2:49 p.m. The rats were in the cage. Calla let the party run for another hour. She wanted Marcus to feel surrounded by love, by his brotherhood, by his community. She wanted the contrast between the warmth of the lower garden and the absolute filth happening on the 3rd floor to be as stark as heaven and hell. At 4 p.m., the golden hour sunlight began to filter through the willows. The guests were happily eating, the noise level a joyful, chaotic din. Calla walked over to the DJ booth she had set up. She plugged her iPad into the main mixing board, connecting it directly to the 6 massive stadium-quality Bluetooth speakers mounted around the pavilion. She opened the smart home app. Step 1. She navigated to the security locks. With a single tap of her manicured finger, she remotely engaged the titanium deadbolts on the heavy double doors of the master suite. The locks were designed to withstand a sledgehammer. Julian and Allison were now hermetically sealed inside. Step 2. She opened the hidden microphone feed located in the faux smoke detector above the master bed. Kayla looked out at the crowd. Marcus was sitting at a picnic table with his lieutenant, laughing with a piece of cornbread in his hand. Mrs. Higgins was pouring lemonade. It was a picture of perfect, unblemished happiness. Kayla took a deep breath. She reached over and killed the music. The sudden silence in the garden was jarring. 50 conversations faltered and died. People looked around, confused, thinking the power had tripped. Then, a sound crackled over the massive speakers. It wasn't music. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of a mattress creaking, magnified to a deafening volume. "Oh God, Julian, but right there!" The voice was breathy, high-pitched, and echoing off the stone walls of the pavilion. Every single person in the garden froze. Marcus lowered his cornbread, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He recognized the voice, but his brain, desperately trying to protect him, refused to process it. "You like that, baby?" A deep, smooth baritone groaned in response. "You like how Daddy takes care of you?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered on the flagstone patio with a sharp crack. Marcus stood up. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving him the color of ash. His chest began to heave. That was his father. That was his wife. And their intimate, grotesque betrayal was currently blasting at concert-level decibels across the entire party. But Kayla wasn't done. She didn't just want them caught in the act. She wanted their souls laid bare. She waited, her hand hovering over the volume dial. Upstairs, completely unaware of the public broadcast, the physical sounds subsided, shifting into the post-coital rustling of sheets. "I can't wait until we don't have to hide in this stuffy house anymore." Allison's voice drifted over the speakers, clear as crystal. "When does the bank wire the $500,000? "The loan funded yesterday, baby," Julian's voice replied, sounding smug. "It's sitting in your LLC account. As soon as I transfer the rest of the liquid cash, we are gone. Let the old workhorse choke on the mortgage. She'll be flipping burgers until she's 90. The guests in the garden looked at Kayla in absolute, horrified shock. Mrs. Higgins covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. But Kayla stood perfectly still, her face carved from obsidian, her eyes fixed on her son. "And what about Marcus?" Julian asked, his voice laced with casual cruelty. "He's going to lose his mind when you serve him the papers." A cruel, grating giggle echoed through the speakers. "Let him. He's a meathead. He actually bought the Pregnancy Act. I told him we're trying. Once I show him the positive test next week, he's going to think this baby is his." "It's brilliant," Julian chuckled. "My kid, raised on his child support dime. He's going to be working double shifts at that firehouse for the next 18 years to pay for our life in Miami." The silence in the pavilion was apocalyptic. It was a suffocating, terrifying vacuum of sound, broken only by the horrific words continuing to pour from the speakers. A primal guttural sound suddenly erupted from the picnic table. It wasn't a yell. It was the sound of a man's reality being ripped apart at the seams. Marcus kicked the heavy oak picnic table out of his way with such force that it flipped over, sending plates and glasses crashing to the ground. He didn't run. He marched. Marcus moved toward the stone steps leading up to the main house with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. His jaw was locked, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his skin. "Marcus!" his lieutenant yelled, snapping out of his shock. 3 firemen rushed forward, trying to grab his arms, terrified of what he might do. Marcus didn't even look at them. With a single, violent shrug of his massive shoulders, he threw 2 grown men off him as if they were children. "Get off me!" he growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal frequency. Kayla reached over and muted the audio. The broadcast was over. The physical execution had begun. The entire party, 50 people strong, followed Marcus up the stairs like a silent, ghost-like procession. No one spoke. The gravity of the betrayal was too massive, too vile for whispers. Marcus breached the back door of the mansion, his heavy boots slamming against the hardwood floors of the hallway. He took the grand staircase 3 steps at a time, sprinting toward the 3rd floor. Kala followed closely behind, surrounded by the towering figures of the firemen, ready to intervene if things turned deadly. Marcus reached the heavy double doors of the master suite. He grabbed the brass handles and yanked. The titanium smart locks held firm. From inside the room, muffled voices could be heard. "What was that? Who's out there?" Julian's panicked voice drifted through the thick wood. Marcus didn't answer. He stepped back, measuring the distance. He was a seasoned firefighter. He knew exactly where the structural weakness of a doorframe lay. He raised his heavy, steel-toed boot and delivered a devastating piston-like kick directly next to the lock mechanism. The entire wall shook. The wood splintered. He kicked again. A terrifying, thunderous crack echoed down the hallway. On the third kick, the heavy oak doors exploded inward, the doorframe completely tearing away from the drywall. Marcus stepped into the master bedroom. The scene was exactly as grotesque as the audio had promised. Julian and Allison were scrambled frantically on the California king bed, scrambling to pull the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets over their naked bodies. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a terror so absolute it bordered on madness. And then they looked past Marcus. They saw Kala, standing just outside the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of terrifying serenity. And behind her, filling the hallway, spilling down the stairs, the entire neighborhood. The firehouse crew, the church elders. 50 pairs of eyes staring at them with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute contempt. Julian's brain short-circuited. He looked at the shattered door, at his furious son, at his cold, calculating wife, and the massive crowd. "Marcus, Kala, wait, it's not what you think," Julian stammered, his smooth, baritone voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. Marcus didn't say a word. He just stared at the man who had raised him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence stretched, thick and agonizing. Then Julian did exactly what Kayla knew a coward would do. Faced with his son's intense anger, Julian dropped the sheet and quickly backed against the headboard. His hand shook as he pointed toward Allison, who was crying beside him. "It wasn't my choice," Julian said, his voice unsteady and filled with panic, carrying into the hallway. "She pressured me, Marcus. This has been going on for months. She told me if I refused, she would accuse me of taking money. I didn't know what to do. I feel trapped. Something isn't right here." Allison stopped sobbing instantly. The shock of the betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She stared at Julian, her mouth hanging open. The man she had plotted with, the man who had promised her a life in Miami, had just thrown her under the bus without a second of hesitation. "You lying bastard!" Allison shrieked, her voice turning feral. She launched herself at Julian, her acrylic nails raking across his chest, drawing thin lines of blood. "It was your idea to forge the loan. It was your idea," Julian yelped, trying to push her off, the two of them thrashing violently in the tangled sheets, a pathetic, undignified mess of naked limbs and screaming accusations. Marcus watched them fight for exactly 5 seconds. The rage in his eyes slowly, agonizingly, burned out, leaving behind nothing but a cold, desolate wasteland of absolute disgust. They weren't even worth his anger. They were roaches fighting over a crumb. Marcus turned his back on them. He walked out of the bedroom, his head held high, parting the sea of shocked guests. Kayla stepped into the doorway, stepping over the splintered wood. The room instantly fell silent as Julian and Allison froze, looking up at the matriarch. "Get your clothes on," Kayla said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 20 degrees. "And get out of my house. Both of you." "Kayla, baby, please," Julian started, dropping to his knees on the mattress, reaching out toward her. "If you are not off my property in 5 minutes," Kayla interrupted, her eyes boring into his soul, "I will have Marcus's entire fire crew drag you out by your hair, naked, and leave you on the sidewalk." Julian swallowed hard, scrambling for his pants. Allison was already crying again, frantically pulling her slip dress over her head, humiliated beyond repair. Kala turned around and walked down the hallway, the crowd parting respectfully to let her pass. The social execution was complete. They had been stripped of their dignity, their family, and their reputations, but Kala wasn't finished. As she walked down the sweeping staircase, she pulled out her phone. She had promised them a life in Miami with $500,000. It was time to show them exactly what happened when you tried to steal from the Queen of the South. The silence in Cala's home following the backyard BBQ was not the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets. It was the crisp, clean silence that follows a violent thunderstorm. Marcus had moved his belongings back into his childhood bedroom that very evening. He had packed Allison's designer clothes, her expensive shoes, and her vanity makeup into heavy-duty black trash bags and left them on the front porch for her to collect in the dead of night. He didn't shed a single tear for her. His grief was reserved for the father he had idolized, the man who had burned their family to the ground for a cheap thrill and a payout. For 4 days, Cala and Marcus simply existed in the quiet sanctuary of the Cascade Heights estate. Cala cooked. Marcus fixed the broken doorframe in the master suite. They didn't talk about the betrayal. They didn't need to. The bond between mother and son had been forged in steel, tempered by the fire of surviving the unthinkable. But Cala knew Julian. He was a parasite, and a parasite does not simply walk away from a host without trying to take a pound of flesh. On Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the loan had supposedly funded, a courier arrived at the house. He handed Cala a thick manila envelope sealed with the golden crest of a sleazy, high-profile divorce firm in downtown Atlanta. Cala sat at her kitchen island, put on her reading glasses, and read the demand letter. It was a masterpiece of masculine audacity. Julian, through his attorney, was formally demanding a $2.5 million buyout for his sweat equity in Cala's Soul Kitchen, along with half the value of the Cascade Heights estate and alimony. Furthermore, the letter casually mentioned that Julian and Allison were now in possession of a $500,000 line of commercial credit, giving them a massive legal war chest to tie Cala up in litigation for the next decade if she refused to settle. It was a threat. A clumsy, desperate extortion attempt from a man who thought he still held the high ground. Cala didn't get angry. She didn't cry. She calmly picked up her phone and dialed her corporate shark, Diane Sterling. "Diane?" Cala said smoothly. "The rats are asking for cheese." "Excellent." Diane's raspy, predatory purr came through the receiver. "Bring them to my office at 3 o'clock. Let's set the mousetrap." The conference room at Sterling & Associates was a temple of intimidation. Located on the 42nd floor, its walls were entirely made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. A massive slab of polished black granite served as the conference table. Cala sat at the head of the table. She wore a tailored, plum-colored St. John knit suit, her silver hair pulled back into a flawless chignon. She looked regal, untouchable, the undisputed queen of her empire. Marcus sat to her right, wearing a crisp navy suit, his broad shoulders squared, a silent and imposing guardian. Diane Sterling sat to her left, casually flipping through a legal pad. At exactly 3 p.m., the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Julian walked in first, wearing his signature charcoal suit, though it looked slightly rumpled, as if he had been sleeping in it. Allison trailed behind him, wearing a conservative black dress and dark sunglasses to hide her swollen eyes. They were flanked by a slick-looking attorney in a pinstripe suit, carrying a leather briefcase. They took their seats across the vast expanse of black granite. Julian refused to meet Marcus's eyes. He stared at Cala, his jaw set in a pathetic attempt at defiance. "Mrs. Roberts, Ms. Sterling," Julian's attorney began, not bothering with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and pulled out the demand letter. "My client is prepared to be reasonable. We recognize the unfortunate personal circumstances of the separation. However, Julian Roberts has spent 30 years acting as the chief financial officer of Cala's Soul Kitchen. He is entitled to half of the enterprise value. We are asking for a lump sum of $2.5 million. If you sign today, my clients will walk away peacefully." Diane Sterling didn't even look up from her legal pad. She just laughed. It was a cold, dry sound that echoed off the glass walls. "I'm sorry, did you just say chief financial officer?" Diane asked, looking up, her eyes gleaming with malice. "My apologies, counselor. I was unaware your client held a legally recognized executive position, considering he hasn't signed a single corporate tax return or payroll document in 3 decades. He is her husband. It is marital property," the attorney snapped, his slick veneer cracking slightly. "Furthermore, my clients have recently secured a $500,000 line of commercial credit. We have the capital to freeze your assets in a protracted legal battle. You don't want this in court, Ms. Sterling. Pay the buyout, and we disappear." Julian leaned forward, a smarmy, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "It's over, Cala." Just write the check. You've got the cash. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Kayla looked at the man she had shared a bed with for nearly 40 years. She saw right through the expensive suit and the practiced smile, straight to the hollow, rotting core of him. "Julian," Kayla said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room to freezing, "I am going to say this once, so I suggest you listen very, very carefully." She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a demand letter. It was a certificate from the state of Georgia. She slid it across the smooth black granite. "As of last Monday," Kayla stated, her voice echoing with absolute authority, "the deed to the Cascade Heights estate, the flagship property of Kayla's Soul Kitchen, and all associated liquid business assets were legally transferred into the Marcus Roberts Dynasty Trust. It is an irrevocable blind trust. I am the sole trustee. Marcus is the sole beneficiary. Julian, your name is on absolutely nothing." Julian's arrogant smile faltered. He looked down at the certificate, his eyes darting frantically over the legal jargon. You can't do that. That's marital asset hiding. A judge will reverse that in a second." "A judge might," Diane Sterling interrupted, leaning forward, bracing her elbows on the table like a gargoyle, "if the assets were moved during an active divorce proceeding. But Kayla filed for divorce after the trust was established. More importantly, Julian, the courts tend to look very unfavorably upon spouses who attempt to commit federal bank fraud." Allison flinched so hard she nearly knocked over her water glass. Julian went dead pale. Diane reached into her own folder and pulled out a high-resolution photocopy of the commercial loan application. $500,000, Diane purred. "Secured against the flagship restaurant, funded into AM Holdings LLC, and bearing the supposedly verified signature of Kayla M. Roberts." Julian's attorney looked at the document, then looked at his client, his face draining of color. "Julian, what is this?" "It's a forgery," Diane stated cheerfully. "We have the IP logs proving it was signed from Julian's computer. We also have hours of audio recordings, captured legally inside Kayla's home, of Julian and Allison explicitly discussing the forgery, their plan to steal the money, and their intent to leave Kayla saddled with the mortgage." Julian started to hyperventilate. He tugged at his collar, his eyes wild. "Kayla, baby, wait." "But here is the truly fascinating part," Kayla interrupted, her voice a lethal, silken whisper. "You thought you were so smart, Julian. You thought the bank gave you the money. But Diane here happens to be very good friends with the senior underwriter at that bank." "It was a sting, Julian," Diane smiled, baring all her teeth. "The bank knew the signature was forged the moment you submitted it. But they, alongside the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, wanted to see if you would actually cross the finish line. They let you sign the closing documents on Wednesday. They wired the $500,000 into Allison's LLC account on Thursday." Allison ripped off her sunglasses, her eyes wide with absolute primal terror. But the money is there. I saw it in the account. I tried to wire it to my creditors this morning." "Yes," Diane nodded. "And the moment you hit send, the FBI froze the account. You didn't wire the money to your illegal bookies, Allison. You tripped a federal wire fraud alarm. The FBI is currently seizing AM Holdings LLC. The slick defense attorney stood up, snapping his briefcase shut. He looked at Julian with pure disgust. "You didn't tell me you forged a commercial loan to defraud a federally insured bank. I am withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately. Do not contact my office." He turned and walked out of the room without another word. Julian and Allison were left completely alone, sitting across from the empire they had tried to destroy. The reality of their situation crashed down upon them like a collapsing building. Because Kayla had transferred the restaurant to the irrevocable trust before the loan closed, the bank had zero claim on her business. But Julian and Allison had signed as personal guarantors on a fraudulent loan. They were personally on the hook for $500,000 to the federal government, plus the $240,000 Allison still owed to her violent loan sharks. "Kayla, please," Julian begged, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning his pride. He fell to his knees on the plush carpet, crawling toward the edge of the granite table. "Please, they're going to put me in prison. I'm 64 years old. I'll die in there. Please, just pay them off. I'll sign the divorce papers. I'll give you everything. Just save me." Marcus looked down at his father groveling on the floor. There was no pity in the young captain's eyes. "You already gave up everything, old man. You just didn't realize it until today." "Marcus is right," Allison suddenly shrieked, standing up. Cornered and desperate, the venomous snake struck out one last time. She pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. "You think you won? You think you're so smart? Well, guess what, Marcus? I'm pregnant. I'm carrying your father's baby. And the second this kid is born, I'm taking you to court. As my legal husband, you'll be presumed the father. I'll drag you through the mud. I'll garnish your firefighter wages for the next 18 years. You'll be paying for the child I made with your own dad." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He just slowly turned his head to look at his mother. Kayla picked up her designer tote bag and pulled out one final document. It was a sterile white sheet of paper from a private genetics laboratory. "You really should learn to properly dispose of your medical waste, Allison," Kayla said softly. "My private investigator, Vance, is very thorough. He pulled your discarded iced coffee cup from the clinic trash bin. He also pulled a few strands of hair from the comb Julian left in the master bathroom. We had the lab run an expedited, non-invasive prenatal paternity screen." Kayla slid the paper across the table. It stopped right in front of Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor. "Read it, Julian," Kayla commanded. Julian's trembling hands reached up and pulled the paper off the edge of the table. He read the highlighted section at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. Julian froze. Slowly, his bloodshot eyes lifted from the paper and locked onto Allison. It's not mine?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Of course it's not yours, Julian," Kayla said, her voice laced with absolute, crushing pity. "Vance ran the secondary DNA markers through the database. Allison, did you really think you could sleep with one of your loan shark's muscle men to buy yourself more time, get pregnant, and pin it on my son? Or my husband?" Allison's face collapsed. The color drained from her skin until she looked like a corpse. She backed away from the table, shaking her head frantically. No, that's not true. Julian, I swear." Julian let out a raw, animalistic scream. He lunged at Allison, grabbing her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "You played me. You ruined my life. I lost my wife. I lost my son. I'm going to prison for you." "Get your hands off me, you old fool," Allison screamed back, slapping him across the face. Kayla stood up, buttoning the jacket of her plum-colored suit. She didn't stay to watch the rest of the pathetic, undignified brawl. She looked at Marcus and offered him her arm. "Come on, baby," Kayla said, a genuine warm smile breaking across her beautiful face. "Let's go home. Mama's making peach cobbler." Marcus smiled, a bright, unburdened smile, and linked his arm through hers. They walked out of the glass boardroom together, the heavy mahogany doors closing behind them, sealing Julian and Allison inside the tomb of their own making. 6 months later, the air inside Kala and Son's southern table was heavy, woven with the rich, intoxicating aromas of slow-simmered collard greens and smoked turkey wings. It was a Friday night in Buckhead, the most upscale district in Atlanta. This was Kala's newest location, a massive 2-story flagship restaurant with crystal chandeliers and exposed brick. The line of hungry customers wrapped around the block. Kayla stood in the kitchen, wearing her immaculate white chef's coat. Her silver hair was pulled back into its neat, no-nonsense braided bun. She was 63 now, but she felt 20 years younger. The heavy, parasitic weight that had dragged her down for decades was gone. Julian was currently residing in a federal penitentiary in Florida, serving a 10-year sentence for wire fraud. Without Kayla's money to afford a good lawyer, the public defender had easily convinced him to take a plea deal. Allison had vanished. Word on the street was that she had fled the state in the middle of the night to escape her creditors, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of unpaid bills and a tarnished reputation. The divorce between her and Marcus had been finalized swiftly, with Marcus walking away completely unscathed. The double doors of the kitchen swung open. Marcus walked in, wearing a custom-tailored suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He had retired from the fire department to take over as the legitimate chief financial officer of the newly formed Roberts Dynasty Enterprise. He was brilliant at it, treating his mother's money with the respect and care it deserved. "Table 4 needs a refill on the sweet tea, Mama," Marcus smiled, coming over to kiss her cheek. "And the food critic from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is sitting at table 12. He's already crying over the brisket." "Let him cry, baby," Kayla laughed, her voice a rich, resonant alto that echoed over the sizzle of the fryers. "That's just the ancestors' seasoning." She looked around her kitchen. Her staff was moving like a well-oiled machine. Her son was standing proudly by her side. Her empire wasn't just standing. It was thriving, built on a foundation of absolute truth, hard work, and unbreakable family loyalty. Calla Roberts had been tested by the fire, and she had proven, once and for all, that she was the one who controlled the flames.